if Vikings ate so many carbohydrates, then why were they so jacked? Why were they ripped? This is kind of confusing. There's other regions that are like this too, but like the Vikings were pretty much depicted as these pretty like buff, lean, ripped, healthy people that had a lot of energy to fight, right? But you look at their diet, and it was a pretty decent amount of carbohydrates. Now, there's one very important piece that goes along with this, actually two, and we're gonna highlight them, and then we're gonna break down the carbohydrates they consume and how this might have really come into play. The first thing that was the most important is even though they ate a high amount of carbohydrates, they ate an even higher amount of protein. Now, some of the literature suggests that if you consume protein, that it's going to bring your glucose levels down. In a lot of ways, protein can grant you a fair bit of amnesty in your carbohydrate intake. So it's like, if you consume a lot of protein, you can consume a fair bit of carbohydrates without huge spikes. That has to do with simple digestion, it has to do with metabolomics. There's a number of different factors at play, but it's a very simple thing to understand. But the other thing that we have to look at is the kinds of carbohydrates they were consuming and what this was doing to them on the inside. Okay, so you have to think about it from a perspective of where the Vikings were geographically. Very cold climate, right? So it's not like they could just have an abundance of carbohydrates readily available. As a matter of fact, it was even too cold to grow wheat in a typical fashion. There are regions of like the Nordic that started to be able to grow wheat, but that was kind of later on, and it was a little bit more of a technological advance more than anything. Barley was usually like the staple grain, and barley is not something that like you can mass produce it, but it's pretty low glycemic, and we'll talk about kind of the specific fiber that's in it. But I think the most important thing to note here is that most of the carbohydrates they were consuming were root vegetables. And the cool thing is that this is something that you can adopt today, because I did another video breaking down the entire Viking diet, but I wanted to focus specifically on the carbohydrates with this one, because people get confused on what carbohydrates to eat. They even ask me, what carbohydrates do I typically eat? And I usually tell them, sweet potatoes, I eat carrots, I eat parsnips, I'll eat regular potatoes. Like a lot of what I consume, I even consume tapioca and cassava. I eat a lot of root vegetables because I just feel like they work for me really well. Like if I eat rice, I kind of get wheezy. There's no malice on rice, but like I find with a lot of grains, I feel inflamed. Like I even feel it in my lungs and my bronchoconstriction. Like I just feel like I don't breathe as well. It's bizarre. Either way, so I eat a decent amount of carbs, but most of them are from these root vegetables. And when you understand, wait a minute, the amount of soluble fiber and the low glycemic nature of these root vegetables, this is pretty powerful. No wonder they were able to consume a high amount and not have a problem. But we're gonna break them down specifically with the kinds of carbs and veggies that they would eat the most of so we can kind of get a little bit more of an understanding. But before I get into that, it's really important you know that they were an active culture, okay? People kind of, they don't like it when I say this, but carbohydrates are kind of something that you have to be okay with earning a little bit. And I don't mean that in a weird kind of you need to fear food and this and that. I mean it in a simple sense that our bodies function just fine without carbohydrates. We don't need them, realistically. I went 0 carb for a very long time and I felt tremendous and my body functioned great. But one thing that carbohydrates can do is they can provide what I would almost consider exogenous fuel. If you're an athlete, you will get an extra edge. It's extra fuel, but it doesn't mean that you can't do it without it. You absolutely can. Your body's not that fragile, ladies and gentlemen. It can handle it. Okay, so with this culture being a very active culture, it made sense that they were able to consume those kinds of carbohydrates. Their macronutrient ratio was about 35% protein, 30% carbs, and 30 to 35% fats. So it was actually more protein than it was carbohydrates. But people would look at that and they'd say, that's a lot of carbohydrates just based on sheer volume. Let's talk about onions for a second. Onions and leeks were a huge component of their diet. I wish we could go back and analyze the microbiome of the Vikings, because the kinds of foods that they would eat just made so much sense for a good microbiome. Fair amount of fermented food, okay? And then of course, onions and leeks, one of the best prebiotic fibers that you can eat. Have you ever had French onion soup and then ended up with a bunch of gas afterwards? Yeah, because you're not adjusted to all the prebiotic fiber that's in the onions. Okay, so point is that it's a very tremendous fuel for the bacteria in your gut. When you consume prebiotic fibers, it is literally a fuel that bacteria feed and then cross-feed on to proliferate and create new strains and grow new strains. It's a complex process, but it's very important. Same thing with like leeks, for example. Also consuming a lot of carrots, extremely high vitamin A and carotenoids. So this is good at an antioxidant level, very, very good for the eyesight, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a number of things there, but that's a relatively high glycemic carbohydrate. But it would change its glycemic number based on how it was cooked. If you heated a carrot, then it would be pretty high glycemic, but if it cooled, then it would be lower glycemic. Same thing with a parsnip. Lots of parsnip consumption for the Vikings. Parsnips have the ability to be a very fast-acting carbohydrate when consumed hot, but if it would naturally cool a little bit, it would be less glycemic. So it's very intriguing to understand this. Now, one of the most interesting aspects, and I'm not a big grain guy, but barley is a unique grain because of the beta glucans that are in it. And I personally think that this could have been one of the reasons why the Vikings were such a healthy culture overall. They probably had a tremendous microbiome given the kinds of fiber they would consume. Beta glucans, there are 250,000 glucose molecules that are basically bound together in a beta glucan. So what happens is we don't have the enzymes to break down those beta glucans into individual glucose molecules. So what happens is we end up fermenting that, and it ends up being tremendous fodder, fertilizer for our gut microbiome, which is exactly what we're looking at. In today's world, it's a little bit harder because our diets are crazy and we've got all kinds of things coming in and coming out. But I would say if there's one thing that people can do, like with their diet, it's consume more of these root vegetables, consume more of things like mushrooms and occasionally barley if you like it, because it's got those beta glucans in it. Also, oatmeal that you heat and then cool into a resistant starch. That's going to be high beta glucan. I'm not a big fan of cooking oatmeal and having it hot. I like it lower glycemic, so I heat it and then I cool it. Now, I would couple this with a good probiotic because then you're actually able to get a probiotic effect along with the fertilizer beta glucan sort of prebiotic effect. If you need a good probiotic, I put a link for Seed. It's the one that I always recommend on this channel because I don't typically like probiotics because they're usually marketed hype. But Seed actually conducts their own microbiome research. They have paved the way for multiple clinical trials. They are really putting their money where their mouth is. And it's a cool technology with a prebiotic and a probiotic all in one capsule. So if you look at the capsules, you break them open, there's actually a capsule inside of the existing capsule. So it's like 2 capsules in one for a multi-stage sort of delivery. Really cool stuff. Anyway, that link is down below. That's a 25% off discount link. So 25% off Seed Daily Symbiotic. Again, that's a link that's gonna get you that 25% off that you can only get through me. So that link, top line of the description underneath this video. Now, if you don't wanna just take my word for it, European Journal of Nutrition published a paper where they had different groups consume wheat, ranging up to wheat and barley mixes up to straight barley, looking at beta glucan content. Long story short, the higher the beta glucan content, straight barley versus wheat, the straight barley led to significantly lower blood sugar levels, postprandial and even like 2 hours postprandial. So basically lower glucose levels overall. Now, there's another study that looked at barley and beta glucans. They found that when barley was consumed compared to other starches, there was a 30% increase in glucose uptake, meaning the carbohydrates were soaked into the muscle so they could actually be used for fuel better, and a 29% lower glucose level, blood glucose. So the carbs went to where they're supposed to go. This is highlighting the most important thing. Like if there's something that you can take away from Carbohydrates 101, carbohydrates are not the problem. It is only if you have the inability to use them. If you can consume carbohydrates and your body can suck those up and use them, eat them all day long and use them. They're fun. It's like, I don't know, it's like going on a performance enhancer when they actually work. But there's so many reasons why people that are metabolically dysfunctional, when they eat carbohydrates, they actually feel worse because their uptake isn't good. They don't suck them up and use them right. So it just contributes to high glucose, high HbA1c, high circulating insulin, concentrating, higher amounts of inflammation, whatever, as a result. So the stimulus response, the Pavlovian response there is like, I don't want to eat those, I feel like garbage. when the problem isn't necessarily the carbohydrates. It is if it's sugar and refined garbage over the long haul. But don't be afraid of an apple or a sweet potato or a parsnip or a root vegetable because it has carbs in it. You have to get your body right. And one of the best ways that you can get your body right first is by introducing carbohydrates that have a better uptake and that are lower glycemic. So if you're saying like, hey, I don't feel good when I eat carbohydrates, perhaps eating like a Viking by eating more, say, onions and eating those leeks and eating those, even though sweet potatoes aren't necessarily Viking-ish, sweet potatoes, regular potatoes, parsnips, if I didn't say those already, all these other kinds of beets, okay? Think about these things. Whenever it's a root vegetable, even someone like Liver King, I'm gonna use that example, who's extreme and set in his ways, is still a fan of the occasional root vegetable. Even Paul Saladino will occasionally eat a tuber, right? Because indigenous tribes are like, okay, yeah, if we come across like this root or this tuber, we'll eat it. So even the extreme people are still semi-fans of it. But if you're going to consume these carbohydrates, it just makes the most sense from a fiber perspective, from a glycemic perspective, from a prebiotic like beta-glucan perspective. But at the end of the day, don't be mistaken. The carbohydrates are okay because the amount of protein is matched or above. If there's one thing that you can take away from this is that your protein and your carbohydrates need to at least be matched. You shouldn't have more carbs than protein. At the very least, you should be matched. Best case, more protein than carbs. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.